Have you ever wondered why the person who acted like they never needed you suddenly seems to be falling apart after you left? Here's the truth that most people never hear. The strongest looking narcissist is often the closest to breaking when they lose the one thing they believed they owned: your emotional investment. But don't mistake what you're seeing. This isn't necessarily heartbreak. It's something much deeper, much darker. And by the end of this talk, you'll understand why walking away can trigger a psychological crisis they never saw coming. If you've escaped a toxic relationship, I want you to stay with me, because what I'm about to explain could completely change the way you interpret everything that happened after the breakup. And as you listen, ask yourself one question. Were they really missing you? Or were they missing the control they had over you? The first thing many people misunderstand is why a narcissist seems to unravel after someone leaves. It's easy to assume they're devastated because they lost the relationship. But in many cases, what truly shakes them is the loss of control they had within that relationship. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, control isn't simply about making decisions or having influence. It's about preserving a carefully constructed sense of self that depends on other people's attention, admiration, compliance, and emotional reactions. When you were constantly explaining yourself, seeking their approval, defending against their accusations, or trying to keep the peace, you were unknowingly feeding a system that helped them maintain emotional stability. The moment you stop participating, that system begins to fail. Suddenly, they can no longer predict your responses, manipulate your emotions, or rely on your presence to reinforce the image they have of themselves. This loss creates a deep sense of instability because the relationship was never just about love or companionship. It was also about maintaining psychological control over an important source of validation. That is why some narcissistic individuals react with relentless texting, unexpected apologies, intense anger, guilt trips, or dramatic attempts to pull you back into the relationship. These behaviors are often less about reconnecting with you as a person and more about restoring the dynamic that allowed them to feel secure and powerful. Understanding this distinction is essential because it helps survivors stop personalizing the narcissist's reactions. Their emotional turmoil is not necessarily proof of profound love or genuine remorse. More often, it reflects the distress that comes from losing access to the influence, predictability, and validation that once helped keep their fragile self-image intact. One of the most important concepts to understand is that a narcissistic person's sense of identity is often built on external validation rather than a stable internal sense of self. Most emotionally healthy people develop self-worth from within. They can appreciate praise, but they don't depend on it to feel valuable. They can handle criticism, disappointment, and rejection without feeling as though their entire identity is falling apart. A narcissistic individual, however, frequently relies on admiration, attention, status, success, or the approval of others to maintain a positive self-image. This is because beneath the confident exterior, there is often a fragile and deeply insecure sense of self that constantly seeks reassurance from the outside world. Every compliment, every display of admiration, every act of compliance from others becomes evidence that they are important, superior, or worthy. When that steady flow of validation is interrupted, it can create intense emotional discomfort. Suddenly, the image they've worked so hard to project no longer feels secure. They may become unusually defensive, angry, anxious, or desperate to regain the attention they have lost. This is why they often surround themselves with people who admire them unquestioningly, or seek environments where they can receive constant recognition. It isn't simply a preference for praise. It becomes a psychological necessity to keep self-doubt buried beneath the surface. When someone who once provided admiration, emotional attention, or compliance decides to walk away, the narcissistic individual loses an important mirror reflecting back the identity they want to believe about themselves. Without that reflection, they may feel confused, threatened, or emotionally destabilized. Recognizing this pattern helps explain why their reactions after a breakup often seem so intense, inconsistent, or disproportionate to the situation itself, even when they previously acted as though they never truly cared about the relationship. When someone stops feeding a narcissist's ego, the effects can be far more significant than most people realize, because the loss goes beyond the relationship itself. Throughout the relationship, every compliment, every second chance, every emotional reaction, and every effort to gain their approval may have served as a form of psychological fuel. Whether the attention was positive or negative, it reinforced their sense of importance and confirmed that they still had influence over another person's emotions. This ongoing reinforcement helped stabilize the image they had created of themselves as powerful, desirable, or indispensable. When you decide to step away, establish firm boundaries, or become emotionally unavailable, that steady source of reinforcement suddenly disappears. The silence that follows is not just the absence of communication. It is the absence of validation they had come to expect. Without that constant feedback, they may begin to experience intense frustration, anxiety, irritability, or emotional disorientation. This is why some narcissistic individuals make repeated attempts to pull former partners back into conflict, even if the relationship has already ended. An argument, an emotional response, or even a message expressing anger can still reassure them that they occupy space in your emotional world. In many cases, indifference is far more unsettling to them than hostility, because indifference signals that their influence is fading. The inability to provoke a reaction can feel like a direct threat to the identity they have spent years protecting. This psychological instability may lead them to seek new sources of admiration, intensify manipulative behaviors, or reinvent themselves in ways designed to attract fresh attention. Understanding this pattern allows survivors to recognize that their decision to disengage is not cruel or selfish. It is often the very reason they are finally able to break free from a cycle that depended on their emotional participation to survive. One of the biggest misconceptions about a narcissistic collapse is the belief that it will look like obvious sadness, quiet reflection, or heartfelt regret. In reality, the collapse is often expressed through behaviors that appear dramatic, chaotic, or even aggressive rather than vulnerable. When a narcissistic individual feels that their sense of control or importance has been threatened, they may respond with explosive anger, blaming others for their distress instead of acknowledging their own emotional pain. They might launch a smear campaign, telling friends, family, or colleagues that you were the abusive or unstable one, hoping to protect their image and regain sympathy. Others may rush into a new relationship almost immediately, not because they have healed or genuinely moved on, but because they are urgently searching for someone who can provide the admiration and attention they have lost. Some become reckless with money, make impulsive decisions, exaggerate their achievements, or dramatically reinvent themselves in an attempt to restore the confidence they no longer feel internally. They may also cycle between idealizing and devaluing people, desperately trying to secure new sources of validation while discarding anyone who challenges their self-image. To an outside observer, these actions can look like confidence or resilience, but beneath the surface, they often reflect emotional instability and an urgent need to escape feelings of shame, rejection, or inadequacy. This is why many survivors become confused when they see the narcissist appearing happy, successful, or surrounded by new people shortly after the relationship ends. Those outward displays are not reliable indicators of inner emotional health. In many cases, they are part of an effort to cover emotional turmoil, maintain a carefully crafted public image, and convince both themselves and others that they remain powerful, desirable, and completely unaffected by the loss of the relationship. If this explanation is helping you understand experiences that once left you confused, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes they were the problem. The more people understand these patterns, the less power toxic dynamics have over them. When you are no longer present in a narcissist's life, something important changes that often has little to do with romance and everything to do with distraction. During the relationship, your attention, emotional energy, and constant responses may have helped keep them from confronting uncomfortable feelings buried deep within themselves. Every argument, every attempt to explain your perspective, every effort to repair the relationship, and every emotional reaction gave them something external to focus on. As long as the relationship revolved around managing conflict, seeking validation, or maintaining control, they could avoid facing their own insecurities, fears, and inner emptiness. Once you walk away and stop participating in that cycle, the distractions begin to disappear. The silence that follows can leave them face to face with emotions they have spent years avoiding. This inner emptiness is not simply loneliness. It is often a profound lack of a stable, secure sense of self that cannot be filled by achievements, possessions, admiration, or temporary relationships. Because these feelings are so uncomfortable, many narcissistic individuals work quickly to escape them. They may immediately seek another relationship, immerse themselves in work, pursue excessive attention on social media, or surround themselves with people who constantly praise them. Others may become increasingly angry, restless, or impulsive because remaining alone with their thoughts feels intolerable. The absence of your emotional involvement removes a buffer that once protected them from confronting their own internal struggles. That is why some appear to unravel after a breakup, even if they previously acted indifferent or insisted they never needed you. The discomfort comes not only from losing a partner, but from losing one of the many ways they kept painful emotions at a distance. Understanding this helps survivors recognize that they were never responsible for filling another person's emotional void, and walking away simply ended a dynamic that had been masking deeper psychological issues all along. Many people hope that when a narcissistic individual experiences a psychological collapse, it will finally lead to self-awareness, genuine remorse, and lasting personal change. While that hope is understandable, it is important to recognize that emotional suffering does not automatically produce insight. A narcissistic collapse simply means that the person's usual ways of maintaining their self-image have been disrupted. It does not mean they have suddenly developed the ability to accept responsibility, empathize with others, or honestly examine their behavior. In fact, for many individuals with strong narcissistic traits, periods of emotional crisis can intensify the very defense mechanisms that created the problems in the first place. Instead of asking themselves what role they played in the relationship's failure, they may become even more convinced that they were betrayed, misunderstood, or unfairly treated. They might rewrite the history of the relationship, blame former partners, portray themselves as victims, or seek constant reassurance from people who will support their version of events. Genuine personal growth requires the willingness to tolerate shame without immediately escaping it through denial, projection, or blame. It also requires consistent self-reflection, accountability, and often long-term therapeutic work. Those qualities cannot be forced by a breakup, rejection, or emotional crisis alone. Some people may temporarily appear changed because they are afraid of losing important relationships or social status. But lasting transformation involves much more than altered behavior during moments of desperation. It requires a fundamental shift in how they understand themselves and relate to others. For survivors, this distinction is essential because it prevents false hope from becoming another source of pain. Seeing someone struggle emotionally may stir compassion, but it should not be mistaken as proof that they have become capable of sustaining healthy, respectful, and emotionally responsible relationships without deep and consistent internal work. One of the hardest lessons for survivors to accept is that another person's emotional crisis is not theirs to fix. After spending months or even years in a relationship with someone who has strong narcissistic traits, many people become conditioned to believe they are responsible for managing that person's moods, preventing their anger, calming their anxiety, or protecting them from the consequences of their own behavior. Over time, this creates an unhealthy sense of obligation where your emotional well-being becomes tied to keeping them emotionally stable. When the relationship ends and the narcissist begins to struggle, it is common to feel guilt, worry, or even a desire to return and help. They may reinforce these feelings by saying that you abandon them, that no one understands them like you do, or that they cannot cope without you. While these statements can be emotionally powerful, they often reflect an attempt to regain the support and control they once relied upon, rather than a genuine commitment to change. Every adult is ultimately responsible for seeking help, managing their emotions, and addressing their own behavioral patterns. Compassion does not require sacrificing your safety, your peace of mind, or your emotional health. In fact, repeatedly rescuing someone from the consequences of their actions can unintentionally enable the very behaviors that keep the unhealthy cycle alive. Healthy relationships are built on mutual responsibility, where both people take ownership of their actions and emotional well-being. If one person carries the entire burden of maintaining stability, the relationship becomes increasingly unbalanced and emotionally exhausting. Choosing not to return, even when the other person appears to be struggling, is not an act of cruelty. It is an acknowledgement that lasting healing cannot be given from the outside. It must come from the individual's own willingness to accept responsibility, seek appropriate support, and commit to meaningful personal change. One of the greatest acts of healing after leaving a narcissistic relationship is shifting your focus away from the other person's life and back toward your own. It is completely understandable to wonder whether they are suffering, whether they regret losing you, or whether they are finally experiencing the consequences of their actions. These questions often arise because your mind has been conditioned to monitor their emotional state for a long time. You may have spent months or years anticipating their reactions, avoiding conflict, and trying to predict what would keep the relationship stable. Even after the relationship ends, that habit of watching them can remain deeply ingrained. However, every moment spent checking their social media, asking mutual friends for updates, or imagining whether they are emotionally collapsing keeps your attention tied to someone you have already worked so hard to leave behind. True healing begins when your energy is redirected toward rebuilding your own sense of identity, confidence, and emotional security. As we bring this discussion to a close, remember one essential truth. Someone else's collapse is not your victory, and it is not your responsibility. If the narcissist in your life is struggling after you walked away, that struggle belongs to the choices they have made and the emotional patterns they have spent years reinforcing. Your decision to leave did not create their instability. It simply exposed what was already there beneath the surface. It's also important not to confuse emotional chaos with personal transformation. A crisis may force someone to confront discomfort, but only genuine accountability, self-reflection, and a willingness to change can lead to lasting growth. Until those qualities are present, the same unhealthy patterns are likely to repeat no matter who enters their life next. Your greatest achievement is not watching them fall apart. Your greatest achievement is reclaiming your peace, rebuilding your confidence, and creating a life where manipulation, fear, and emotional exhaustion no longer define your daily reality. Every healthy boundary you maintain is a reminder that your well-being matters. Every step you take toward healing is proof that you are no longer living under someone else's control. So instead of asking whether they are collapsing, ask yourself something far more powerful. Am I becoming the person I was always meant to be before I lost myself trying to save someone else? Because the moment your healing becomes more important than their behavior is the moment you truly break free. And that is where your new life begins.